who don't want to be around it.
Jan, if I might take a moment, and I don't want you to lose your train of thought, but I understand that you had your own haunting experience as well when you lived in a very old house in New England that was haunted. Could you tell us about that?
I absolutely would love to. It was, first of all, it was really a pretty house. It was about 14 rooms, 2 stories, and it was built in the late 1700s, and it was on the New England coast, and you could see the ocean from it. And it had features like the original rippled glass was in the window, some of the windows. It had original wallpaper on the wall, but it had been restored partially, but not remodeled. So it was essentially the same old place that, it had been. And no one had lived there full time since the original family. And I think that they had died out or sold it like in the 1930s. And subsequent to that, it had been a summer house. So up until that point, no one until my then spouse and I had lived there during the whole winter, during the whole year. And so I don't know whether that brought something on or whether it was always haunted. But I did speak to other people who had spent time there, and they too had noticed a lot of unusual things. So anyhow, I think the first one thing that we noticed right away, we had a very large dog. It was a Newfoundland puppy, and it probably weighed 100 pounds at the time. And that dog would not go into a couple of the rooms. I mean, it absolutely wouldn't. In one of the rooms that was very creepy, the dog would stand in the threshold and shake and lean back. It would not go in the room at all. So that was one thing. The dog noticed something. Then one room that we were going to use for our bedroom that was downstairs was this beautiful room with a fireplace and a bay window. It looked out on the ocean. It was just beautiful. But we both felt it was very creepy. And you felt at night like someone was staring at you. It was very, very creepy. And so we ended up, by mutual agreement, without really talking about it, moving upstairs to another room, which was much better. Then one day, we invited people over for dinner. We're all downstairs eating, and nobody else is home. But upstairs, you could hear footsteps, doors opening and closing, and the little deadbolt locks being turned. So everybody kind of looked at each other. We knew something was going on, and we kind of didn't really address it. We just went on with dinner. And it wasn't really scary if you didn't think about us being the only people there. So that was one thing. Another thing was that, and this I understand is quite typical in haunted houses, things would disappear from their usual spot, and you'd find it later someplace totally unrealistic that you would never put it. I found books in the refrigerator, things like that, just completely unreal. And so it went, and sometimes you just felt watched. It was uncomfortable. There were 2 rooms that most of the manifestations happened in, and one of them was upstairs, and it was right over. It should have been the warmest room in the house because it sat in a room. It was over this room that had a Franklin stove and open registers, so that heat would just go right upstairs. But it was colder than all the other rooms, and it was a very uncomfortable place to be. I mean, even in the broad daylight, it just didn't feel right. So that was another thing.
Jan, could I ask a question?
You certainly may.
This is Wendy. Did you ever choose to do anything to bless the house or clear it or balance it or ask it to work with your energy? Or did that just not fit your belief system, or did you not have that knowledge at the time?
Well, this was quite a long time ago, Wendy, so that wasn't something that crossed our threshold at all. Although now, it's interesting that you bring that up, because as clergy, I've often been asked to bless places and to clear areas where there's a negative feeling, and it definitely does make a difference. I wish I had known about it then. So great question. what happened, we ended up having one kind of really scary thing happen that fortunately I slept through. I'm so grateful. I don't know what I would have done if it had happened to me, but my husband at the time actually saw a ghost one night, and this ghost, this figure, he saw, it was, how do I explain this? It was like he woke up in the middle of the night, and he tried to wake me up, and I'm a real light sleeper, but I was like, he couldn't budge me. And he saw a lot of like bright lights, and they formed into a figure of a person, like a woman in a very old-fashioned long dress. And without speaking, she communicated like telepathically to him, and she communicated that she had no issue with him, but that there were some negative ghosts in the house, and we should leave as soon as we could, or we would be in danger. And when I woke up in the morning, he told me about it. And we had been planning to move anyway. We were renting the house. And so as it happened, we were out of there in a couple weeks, which was good, I think, under those circumstances. So that was my own haunted house story.
In your working with parish work, you accumulated various stories from different people in hospitals and hospice settings. Have those made it into the books? Is that some of the research material that you... Yeah, tell us a little about that.
Well, one of the things, when you talked about, when Wendy mentioned about clearing places, when I worked in a hospital, I worked in several hospitals as a chaplain, and there were times, and it's natural, I mean, think about it. Hospitals are places where people are sick and where they die and where there's a lot of, it can be difficult, even with the best staff and the, best of everything. There's a lot of energy there that's not the greatest. And sometimes spaces get kind of negative, and I was often asked to go in and sort of clear a space, which I would do. I would bless it and, sprinkle holy water, and often that really helped, and it would be lighter. Sometimes it would be a room where several people had died in a row, and it just seemed to accumulate. Another thing that happened just so often, and this is one of the things that made me want to write about it. It was after I started working in the hospitals that I realized that, and working as a clergy person, I realized that paranormal experiences are not really paranormal. They're normal. They happen to so many people. And people often they're afraid to talk about it. Now, when I lived in England, that wasn't true. It's much more accepted there. There's, things are haunted. People talk about it. It's accepted. No big deal. But here, until lately, that people wouldn't. Now it's quite popular, but people didn't want to discuss it. And so, one of the reasons that I wrote my book about ghosts, a useful handbook, is to give people some support, to let them know that this happens to countless people, and that they have all kinds of paranormal or spiritual or ghostly experiences that are difficult to explain. That doesn't make them less real. They're real. And so that was one of the things that really motivated me to write. One kind of story that happens a lot in hospice and in hospitals is that a lot of times before people die, they will see a family member or a spirit of someone that they knew, and they find it, their family would tell me about this, or sometimes the patient would tell me. And they found it quite reassuring. And it's happened so often that I don't think that many people wouldn't be making this up. One particular instance that I remembered was a woman who was a patient in a hospice that I worked for, who had end-stage dementia, so she hadn't spoken for a long, long time, and she was very close to death. Her daughter walked in one day to hear her mother carrying on a conversation quite lucidly with somebody in the corner, although no one was there. But it was like her old mother was back. She was talking. She was very lucid. After that, it ended, and then the mother passed away a couple days later. But the daughter was convinced that she had actually seen someone, and medically speaking, it's very difficult to explain the lucidity when she had been non-conversational and not lucid for so long. So that's the kind of thing. Go ahead.
There's a wonderful TED Talk on that exact topic from a gentleman named Dr. Christopher Kerr, Kerr. I don't know if you're familiar with, and he is a hospice director in Buffalo, New York, and has done a lot of research and has been filming patients and showing that they are lucid, not demented. They're not in the state of dementia. It's easy to tell the difference between the two. But because our traditional medical community is not used to allowing for lucid dreaming and for what you're describing of these great conversations going on, and they go to the place, too often can go to the place of, oh my goodness, they must be in a state of dementia, et cetera, or some other state, when it's actually lucidity. It's they're passing on, and they're connecting with their guides, they're connecting with their ancestors and their loved ones, and getting a lot of comfort to be prepared to pass over. So it's a great TED Talk.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. I'll have to look it up. Thank you for sharing that. I'm trying to think. That the whole subject, I think, of people having visions around the time of their death is really fascinating, and it just happens so often that I think it's probably quite more common than people expect. One of the things I touched on a few minutes ago, but didn't really get into, was that I spent some time in England. I went to school there for a year, and I found that people there were much more likely to talk about their experiences. And the school that I attended, actually, the dorm was haunted. There was one room that, I swear, the year before I was there was a student had actually been awakened out of sleep and thrown out of his bed by a spirit. And the library was haunted, which I can vouch for because I was there a lot. And it wasn't bad, but you just knew something was watching you. You felt something. It was there. And I had a real interesting experience at the parish church in the town, the village that I lived in. I was in one morning preparing for the morning service, and it was still dark. It was really very early, and it was winter. And it was a very old church. It was like from the 1200s. It was Norman. And I'm in there, I'm all alone, and there are no walls. Everything is like wide open. You can see everything. And I heard footsteps, and they were really heavy, and I was wearing rubber-soled shoes. I knew it wasn't me. And I went back to what I was doing, and I heard them again, and it was so creepy that I got really frightened, and I finished what I was doing, and I just locked up and got out of there as soon as I could. But that kind of thing, I guess, is quite common over there, and here too, for that matter. But that's one that I definitely heard, and it was pretty interesting. It got my attention.
You talked about doing graduate work at Oxford and Berkeley. I'm sure in that research you ran across a lot of the phenomena as well. Could you tell us a little more about that as well?
Yes. Well, one of the things that I ended up doing, I've been a nonfiction writer, writing about spirituality and fiction and the spirituality of the ghost story and things like that, because I've been really interested in how people address the paranormal in literature. And I have my co-author, Bill Coopersmith, and I have written a number of nonfiction book chapters and journal articles on the subject. And as I said, I teach continuing education courses for psychologists, chaplains, clergy, healthcare people, all these social workers in this area. And it's always really interested me because of the context is so interesting. There's so many different kinds of experiences, and they're expressed in literature in different ways. And as I've mentioned some of them. For example, the post-mortem retribution, where the ghosts come back and they get even. That's quite a common theme, and it poses questions of moral theology and ethics. What's right, what's wrong. And so that was one thing. There's a lot of interesting theories that you run into. One theory that I got interested in an archaeologist from Cambridge who, I think he died in the 70s. His name was T.C. Lethbridge, and he was very controversial. He was sort of he was like an Indiana Jones. He was an explorer, he was an archaeologist, and he taught in university until some of his theories about the paranormal became public, and then he broke off with them. They ballyhooed him, and he didn't want anything to do with them after that. And some of his theories are odd, but some of them, I think there's a little something in them that's worth thinking about. He had one theory called the stone tape theory, that he believed that ghosts were not spirits of the departed, but instead were like impressions of the living that were left long ago when they were still living, and especially if they were real intense moments, they were somehow recorded in the house or the natural surroundings. And he theorized that under certain conditions, these could be stored. These events were stored if there was damp rock around. Thus, it was called the stone tape theory. Now, his critics just went to town with that. But if you think about it, while the idea of natural objects retaining images and replaying them like a tape recorder sounds a little like a stretch, the idea of these events being somehow recorded in time may not be so far-fetched. If you take away the tape recording concept and replace it with the events or people from the past being witnessed through, say, ESP, or say, the idea of parallel universe, different, looking into a different time. There's other ways that you could explain it that still kind of give part of this theory some validity. So I think it was really interesting, and I think perhaps the reason he got into the water, the damp rock thing, was that he was also obsessed with dowsing, and he did a lot of research and wrote a book about that. So perhaps. Well, and
Jan, the term psychometry, I'm sure you're familiar with that, comes to mind as well. And many psychics who work in, for example, unsolved murder cases, will touch an object and get an impression, which in many cases actually led to the location of the body of the missing person and that type of thing.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I just started writing about that today. I'm calling this chapter, this essay, The Menace of Things Possessed. And one of the things that I talked about in one of my fiction books, in Rest in Peace, I wrote a story called The Scarab. But part of it is based on a true story about a kind of possessed scarab that was in my family. And I got it from my mother, and she had gotten it. Her parents went on a world tour in the 30s, and they brought her back a scarab from a pyramid in Egypt. And this thing was really weird. It was fastened onto a ring. There was no way to get it off, but it was like a sealing ring. You'd open it, you could make a seal with the bottom of it. And it kept falling off the ring. There was no physical way to explain it, but it did. And one day, it was lost. And it was a small green object, and it got lost on this huge front lawn. And they looked and looked, and they couldn't find it. Well, what happened was, a few months later, my grandparents got a letter from the people in Egypt from whom they had bought the scarab, and on that day, the scarab reappeared. And it was just a very weird kind of object. There are many objects. Many people absolutely refuse to buy antiques or anything used because they believe that they might contain negative energy.
And they can contain really positive energy too. It's an interesting.
Oh, I agree.
It's such an interesting topic. I know you're not taking that position. I understand.
Oh yeah, I'm not one of them.